In our headlines on this Tuesday afternoon, July 25th here in South Korea. North Korea test fires 2 short-range ballistic missiles late Monday and early Tuesday ahead of its Victory Day celebrations, for which the regime has officially invited China to attend. The South Korean economy expands slightly faster than expected in the second quarter of this year on the back of net trade, as exports of chips and cars fell less than imports of natural gas and oil. Meanwhile, BTS member Jungkook's solo single 7 tops the Billboard Hot 100, making him only the second Korean soloist to stand at the top of the chart after bandmate Jimin made headlines 3 months ago. We start across the border. North Korea launches 2 short-range ballistic missiles into the EC minutes apart, one late Monday and the other early Tuesday, in yet another display of blatant defiance. Our Unification Ministry correspondent Arirang reports.
North Korea late on Monday fired 2 ballistic missiles into the sea off the east coast. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said it detected 2 ballistic missiles fired from areas near Pyongyang at 11:55 p.m. on July 24th and at midnight on the 25th. Both missiles flew around 400 kilometers before falling into the sea. This comes after a U.S. nuclear power submarine, the USS Annapolis, arrived at a naval base on South Korea's southern island of Jeju.
This shows the North's intention to respond militarily to Seoul's strategic assets. It could also be interpreted as Pyongyang's willingness to lead the tensions on the Korean peninsula.
The USS Annapolis is not classified as a strategic asset, as it's not nuclear-armed and is equipped with conventional weapons, but it's one of the main U.S. nuclear power submarines in terms of scale. Some pundits also say that the launch is to strengthen solidarity for the upcoming Victory Day in North Korea, which celebrates the 70 years of armistice in the Korean War. Earlier on Wednesday, Pyongyang fired 2 ballistic missiles into the East Sea, and multiple cruise missiles were launched on Saturday as well. South Korea's military said that the consecutive missile launches are a provocation that harms the peace and safety of not only the Korean peninsula but also the international community, urging Pyongyang to stop firing missiles as it's a clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions. It also said that Seoul and Washington will closely watch and prepare for any additional provocations by the North. The United States Indo-Pacific Command also said the North's recent missile launch has caused instability in the Korean peninsula, reaffirming that it will defend the South from any threat. The U.S. official also said it will continue closely communicating with its allies on the situation. A spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State, Matthew Miller, also condemned the North's missile launch while saying that Washington will focus on the diplomatic relationship with Pyongyang and said that talk without preconditions is still open for North Korea. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, North Korea is poised to host its first foreign delegation in well over 3 years. A Chinese delegation has been invited to partake in the regime's Victory Day celebrations this week. Our Lee Kyung-eun reports.
After 3 years and 6 months, North Korea is set to receive its first foreign delegation. It is inviting a Chinese delegation to mark the 70th anniversary of the armistice of the Korean War on Thursday, known as Victory Day by the regime. According to the North Korean Central News Agency on Monday, the invited Chinese delegation is led by Lee Hong-sung, a member of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. Lee's rank is lower than that of Lee Chan-shu, then Chinese top legislator who visited the regime in 2018 for the 70th anniversary of the foundation of the communist state. But his visit will mark the very first official visit by foreign guests in a shift in policy. Since the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020, North Korea has closed its borders, only partially resuming cargo transportation with China last year. The only known case of foreign guests visiting the regime was back in March when China's new ambassador to North Korea, Hwang Sun-woo, took up the post. North Korea has also been taking part in international events with ambassador-level representatives already overseas. This includes the ASEAN Regional Forum for the past 3 years, with this year's forum also attended by its ambassador to Indonesia, Ang Kwang-il, instead of its foreign minister, Choi Sun-hee. Observers largely see the North's first post-pandemic foreign guests coming from China as an apparent show of their ties against South Korea, the U.S., and Japan. But eyes are on whether the two could resume other exchanges, perhaps influencing trains, or keep it at high-level diplomacy for the time being. Young-eun, Arirang News.
Seoul and Tokyo have launched working-level talks on Japan's planned discharge of Fukushima radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. The head of the Bureau for Climate Change and Energy at Seoul's Foreign Ministry, Yoon Soo, and the Director General of the Disarmament, Non-Proliferation and Science Department at Tokyo's Foreign Ministry, Atsushi Kaifu, have sat down in the Japanese capital city on this Tuesday. On their agenda is the possibility of Korean experts joining the Japanese discharge monitoring team. A request to this end was made by President Yoon Suk-yeol to his Japanese counterpart, Fumio Kishida, on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Lithuania earlier this month. Also, on this Tuesday afternoon here in Seoul, President Yoon Suk-yeol is meeting with the Prime Minister of Luxembourg and the Governor-General of New Zealand. According to the top office, the President is hosting separate talks at the Yongsan Presidential Office with Luxembourg's Prime Minister Xavier Bettel and New Zealand Governor-General Cindy Kiro, who are here to represent the respective countries that participated in the Korean War as part of the UN forces. Officials from some 22 countries have been invited to Seoul to attend a ceremony this week marking the 70th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement that put an end to active combat, which coincides with the UN Forces Participation Day this coming Thursday. And President Yoon Suk-yeol has called for tangible efforts to better protect the rights of faculty members at schools. Now, this comes amid the shocking suicide of a teacher in her classroom last week. Our presidential correspondent Kim Do-yeon reports.
President Yoon Suk-yeol has called for measures to protect the nation's teachers and their rights in the classroom as he met with his top secretaries on Monday. This comes as a public elementary school teacher appeared to have taken her own life in her classroom last week after reportedly being under huge stress from her students' parents. The top office says by next month there will be clear guidelines set by the Education Ministry that meets the current education laws and stance of the presidential office in terms of teacher authority when it comes to guiding students.
The President instructed the Ministry of Education to promptly prepare specific guidelines to reflect the revisions of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and its enforcement decree.
Strengthening teachers' rights has been a core task for the Yoon administration since its beginning. Last year, the public education law was amended to allow teachers to educate students on behavior, while in June, a decree was revised to give teachers the right to comment on students' character.
Since its inauguration, the Yoon administration has consistently pursued a policy of strengthening teaching authority. It's based on the policy's philosophy that establishing conditions justifies the education being given and, in turn, benefits the students.
President Yoon also ordered a revision to unreasonable educational ordinances that allow a teacher's authority to be violated. This is an apparent reference to the Student Human Rights Ordinance introduced in 2010, banning certain disciplinary measures and removing constraints on personal items carried into schools and the use of mobile phones. It's currently adopted by 7 regional education offices, including Seoul's, but has been criticized by some educational experts for taking away teachers' rights in their classroom. However, it has remained controversial as it was pushed by left-leaning educational experts and politicians. On the other hand, some of the teachers were quoted in local reports as saying that while the ordinance could allow certain violations to happen, it is not the fundamental problem to the situation at the moment, and a more deep discussions are needed. In the meantime, the teacher who appeared to have taken her own life was a 23-year-old woman in charge of first graders at Seoul's Hoi Elementary School in southern Seoul. Ever since her death, teachers across the nation have shown their anger towards the current system while calling for change. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The Korean economy expanded slightly above market expectations in the second quarter, staying on track for recovery after avoiding a technical recession in the first quarter of this year. Our economics correspondent Lee Soo-jin has more on the latest performance.
South Korea's economy has grown for the second consecutive quarter. Data from the Bank of Korea released on Tuesday shows that the country's gross domestic product adjusted for inflation rose 0.6% on quarter during the April to June period of this year. The nation narrowly avoided falling into recession, typically defined as 2 consecutive quarters of economic contraction, in the first quarter by achieving a growth rate of 0.3%. This is the second straight quarter that the country has seen economic growth. The central bank attributed the on-quarter growth to the rise in net exports. Net exports rose in the second quarter as total imports fell more sharply compared to total exports. Imports dropped 4.2% compared to exports falling 1.8%.
The growth was led by the increase in net exports from the larger decline in imports. Imports fell sharply, mostly due to decreased imports of natural gas and oil.
Private consumption, however, fell 0.1% compared to the previous quarter, mainly due to the decrease in spending on food and accommodation. Government expenditure dropped nearly 2% on the back of decreased spending on Social Security benefits. Investment in construction and facilities also each tumbled 0.3% and 0.2% amid the sluggish demand for transportation equipment.
In-person activities fell partly due to poor weather conditions, but these are temporary factors.
Meanwhile, South Korea's gross national income, the total amount of money earned by people and businesses, remained unchanged from the previous quarter, despite the rise in real GDP as trade conditions remain sluggish. The Bank of Korea said that if the nation's economy grows 0.7% on quarter during both the third and fourth quarters, it will be able to meet this year's economic growth outlook of 1.4%. 이수진, Arirang News.
Over in Australia, South Korea opened its 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup campaign with a disappointing 2-0 defeat at the hands of Group H rival Colombia on Monday. Now, Colombia opened the scoring from the penalty spot through Catalina Uzme in the 30th minute before Linda Caicedo doubled the South American country's lead 9 minutes later. History was made in the game when South Korea's Casey Eugene Fa joined the action late in the second half, becoming the youngest player ever at a FIFA Women's World Cup. Team Korea faces an uphill battle to advance to the round of 16 and will need to regroup ahead of its next game against Morocco Sunday afternoon. And from soccer to swimming in Fukuoka, Japan, now South Korea's Hwang Sun-woo and Ho-joon are heading to the men's 200-meter freestyle final at the World Swimming Championships. Hwang, last year's silver medalist, finished third, while finished sixth out of 16 athletes in Monday's semi-finals. Only the top 8 can advance to the finals. Now, this is the first time that 2 South Korean swimmers will be going head-to-head at an individual World Championship final. The race starts later this Tuesday at 2 minutes past 8 p.m. Korea time. On the K-pop front, BTS member Jungkook's solo single 7 has hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. And the feat makes him the second Korean soloist to stand at the top of this chart after bandmate Jimin made headlines 3 months ago. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
Less than 2 weeks since the release of his first official solo single, BTS's Jungkook saw himself and his song 7 at the top of the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart on Monday. According to the Billboard chart released Monday, 7 has sold 153,000 song downloads and CD singles combined, while drawing 21.9 million streams and 6.4 million radio airplay audience impressions. The Billboard Hot 100 chart adds the most popular songs of the week in the U.S. across all genres, including streaming, radio airplay, and sales data. Interestingly, yet not surprisingly, Jungkook becomes just the second South Korean solo artist since his fellow group member Jimin topped the chart in April with his single Like Crazy. As a group, BTS and their songs Dynamite, a remix of Savage Love, Life Goes On, Butter, Permission to Dance, and My Universe all topped the Billboard Hot 100 charts, making the K-pop stars a regular at the top of the list. Jungkook is also the sixth member of the seven-piece group to have debuted as a solo artist. Seven is a pop song featuring American female rapper Latto and entered the British official singles chart at number 3. After its official release on July 14th, it also debuted at number 1 on the iTunes charts in 106 countries, as well as Spotify's daily top song global chart. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Over in Israel, people have taken to the streets to protest the passing of a government-led controversial bill that limits the Supreme Court's power to veto government decisions. Our Yoon explains.
The Israeli government on Monday passed the controversial bill that's triggered some of the biggest protests in the country's history. By the evening of the same day, protests against the bill had spread nationwide as thousands of people blocked roads and clashed with police in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and other parts of the country. The so-called reasonableness bill prevents Israel's Supreme Court from overruling government decisions that it considers senseless. It was approved by 64 votes to 0 after the opposition boycotted the final vote. The passing of this law is the first of a broader set of judicial reforms which the government has set out to correct what it describes as a power imbalance. Demonstrations on the streets of Israel have been taking place weekly since the start of the year in an effort to protect what protesters say is an attack on democracy. And at the end of last week, leading up to the parliamentary voting, tens of thousands of protesters marched some 70 kilometers from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and set up camp in a park between the Knesset, which is Israel's parliament, and the Supreme Court. On Monday morning, protesters blocking a boulevard outside the Knesset were sprayed by a water cannon and pulled off the road by police against the backdrop of drums, whistles, and air horns. Injuries and arrests have been reported. Meanwhile, the government says the series of planned reforms serve to strengthen democracy in the country and that the reasonableness bill was necessary because the Supreme Court had accrued too much power over politics in recent decades. The controversial reforms have polarized Israel, triggering one of the most serious domestic crises in the country's history. Former heads of Israel's security services, chief justices, and prominent legal and business figures have also been vocal against the government's reforms. Yoon, Arirang News.
On a light note now, a number of cafes here in Korea are doing more than brewing coffee. They're empowering people with disabilities to better serve their communities. Our Chung Won-ju tells us how.
Junho Jang, a 22-year-old with a developmental disability, is a barista at the Namjong Post Office Cafe in Incheon. The cafe brand he works for was created by the Korea Disabled People's Development Institute. The first branch opened in 2016 in Sejong, and the number has since increased to 88 over the past 7 years. The cafes are opened in surplus spaces at public institutions and private companies, which are provided free of charge, and more than 70% of employees have some type of developmental disorder. This program is different from other welfare projects for the disabled, as it actively pursues sustainable profit-making. Market analysis is conducted before opening the cafe, and the staff is educated in the management of coffee beans. Thanks to this program, about 250 people with a developmental disability have become independent with stable employment.
We plan to continue improving sales through market analysis and customer satisfaction surveys.
Korea Post joined the project at the end of last year and provided space in 4 locations, including Incheon and Daegu. Thanks to this, the cafe brand was able to prepare for further expansion nationwide.
I think the most positive part of creating jobs for people with disabilities is using our infrastructure.
The employment rate for people over the age of 15 with a developmental disability is only 20%. This is lower than the rate for all persons with disabilities, which is 35%. The ultimate goal of the cafe is to provide quality jobs for people with developmental disorders and help them develop the social skills to become independent.
I've been able to get along with new people, and it is satisfying because I've been doing long-term work, so it's rewarding.
People with developmental disabilities are able to bolster their pride as professional baristas working in the cafes. Chung Won-ju, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. At least 17 bodies have been recovered after a boat believed to be carrying migrants and refugees capsized off the coast of the capital Dhaka on Monday. Authorities say 2 people were rescued, but witnesses say more were on board, although the number of people missing is not known. Officials say the victims were likely migrants attempting to reach Spain's Canary Islands. According to aid group Walking Borders, almost 800 people have died or gone missing on the route in the first half of 2023. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin signed legislation on Monday that officially outlaws gender changes in the country. The new law bans gender reassignment surgery and hormone therapy. It also bans changing a person's gender in official documents and annuls marriages where one person has changed gender. Adoptions by such couples are also prohibited. The new legislation is part of a broad crackdown on the local LGBTQ community meant to protect the country's traditional values. It comes half a year after Russia passed a law banning depictions of gay lifestyles, which the government called gay propaganda. And finally, Team Germany got off to a flying start in the 2023 Women's World Cup on Monday with a dominating 6-0 win against tournament debutants Morocco. German captain Alexandra Popp scored twice with 2 headers in the first half in Melbourne. Clara Bühl got Germany's 3rd goal just after halftime. Morocco's problems worsened with 2 own goals before Lea Schüller added a 6th for Germany. On the same day, the opening match from Group G saw Italy win 1-0 against Argentina, while Group F's opener saw Brazil beat Panama 4-0. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. Heavy monsoon rain dropped 30 to 50 millimeters an hour of downpours in Jeollabuk-do province through this morning. Rain has been expanded to more southern regions this morning and should taper off from late this afternoon. The capital and west of Gangwon-do province could see rain lingering into early Wednesday with 10 to 60 millimeters of showers expected. A heavy rain advisory is issued for parts of Jeollabuk-do province, while a heat advisory remains in place in parts of Gangwon-do and Jeju. Monsoon rain is keeping searing heat at bay, though many parts are experiencing tropical nights with overnight temperatures exceeding 25 degrees Celsius. Afternoon highs are similar to slightly higher than Monday. Seoul, Chuncheon, and Gwangju to see a high of 30 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Well, this year's rainy season could get longer due to the after effect of the 5th typhoon of the season, Doksuri, that's forecasted to dissipate in Southeast China this weekend. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And those are the headlines at this hour. Thank you for watching, and do stay tuned for our panel session coming up right after this break.
cover stories on site. From Korea to the world, and from the world to Korea. We ask questions every day that could change the world. Taking news a step further, Arirang News. You're watching Arirang News. You're watching Arirang.
올해가 한국 전쟁이 일어난 지 73년째고 휴전이 된 게 70년째 되는 해입니다. 여태까지 살아있는 게 제가 6.25의 참상을 후진들한테 얘기를 해야 된다는 임명을 받은 것 같아요. 저는 그 6.25 당시에 종군 기자를 했던 한영섭입니다.
오세요. 자, 젓갈이요, 젓갈 사요. 네, 맛보세요. 자, 오징어, 낙지, 청란 다 맛있어요. 자, 드셔보세요. 10시까지 가요. 네, 어서오세요. 반찬 사러 오세요. 반찬 맛있어요. 언니, 이걸로 하나 드릴까요? 이걸로? 다 맛있어요. 네, 13,000원. 예, 안녕히 가세요. 예, 어서오세요. 자, 반찬 사세요, 반찬. 자, 저녁에 밑반찬으로 드세요. 반찬이 맛있어요. 예, 안녕히 가세요. 예, 예.
K-animation, loved and watched around the world. We want to make more animations to reach more children. Traveling time and space. Developing adventure and curiosity. Infinite creativity and hope. We want our children to grow up to be happy. K-animation, watched by children all around the world. So that joy can be felt when our animation is watched. This is the reason we make animation and share with the world. K-animation, befriending children all over the world.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
The US Federal Reserve is poised to share its monetary policy decision for July this week, and most pundits believe the country's benchmark interest rate will be raised by 25 basis points. So what is the reason behind this broad consensus? Will this latest projected hike be the last for the current cycle of tightening policy? And how does the Fed's policy look to affect that of the Bank of Korea? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we take a look at the narrative behind the latest economic numbers and their broader implications. For more on this, I have Professor Kim Se-won at Ewha Women's University live on the line. Professor Kim, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me today.
I also have Professor Shim Myung-gyu at Yonsei University live on the line as well. Professor Shim, it's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Shim, the widespread belief among economists appears to be that the US Federal Reserve will raise its rate by 25 basis points this coming now Wednesday or Thursday. Do you share this outlook, Professor Shim? And if so, why?
Yes, I also agree with the usual prediction that the Fed will raise its policy rate by 25 basis points. The most important reason underlying this outlook is that there are signs that the economy can still endure the potential hike in the policy rate. Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, continuously signals the market, including the financial market, that the Fed will raise the rate. About 20 days ago, he made it clear that the U.S. economy seems to be still strong. Consistent with his view, the unemployment rate in June was 3.6%, which is clearly a good sign for the economy. And it was accompanied by 3% inflation rate, which was even lower than the market expectations. However, this is the figure that is still higher than the target inflation rate in the US, which is 2%, and hence potentially pushes the Fed to raise the policy rate in the upcoming meeting.
Right, I see. And Professor Kim, what is your outlook with regard to the Fed's upcoming decision?
I agree with Professor Shim that in that U.S. Fed will raise its key interest rate by 0.25% this week. After leaving the key interest rate at 5.25% last month, U.S. Fed's key people like Chairman Jerome Powell have been signaling that they will raise interest rate for sure this month. Actually, U.S. inflation is very much stabilized from last year's 9% level to last month 3% level. But it doesn't look that the Fed isn't ready to declare victory on inflation yet. Basically, Fed policymakers and economists are concerned that easing in inflation will be temporary. They see inflation slow down as long overdue after the fading of the pandemic-related shocks that pushed up rents and the prices of transportation and cars in the United States. And they worry underlying price pressure could persist, requiring the Fed to lift rates higher and hold them at the higher level for longer.
Right, and despite those concerns by the US Federal Reserve, Professor Shim, most pundits believe that this latest upcoming hike, that is, will probably be the last of the current cycle of tightening policy. Again, do you agree? And what do you suppose would be the broader implications of another hike in September?
While I totally agree with the view that the hike is expected in this week, as I said, I do like to see more positive signs to expect that the upcoming hike to be the last. First, as is pointed out by Professor Kim, we should notice that the core inflation rate in the US has been lowered by about 1.5% point from the peak, while the CPI inflation rate in the US has declined by about 6% point from the peak in 2022. So this implies that the decline of the CPI inflation rate could be still mainly driven by temporarily stabilized food and energy prices, rather than the overall decline in the price levels. For example, Russia ended Black Sea grain deal about a week ago, which can potentially be an upward pressure on the CPI inflation again. Also, As the tension between Russia and the Western countries continues, the worry over gas supply can grow up in the coming few months. So these factors on further pushes on the CPI inflation, together with the strong signs of economic growth in the US, I'm not sure if the Fed will stop raising the policy rate this year.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, simply speaking, do further rate hikes by the US Federal Reserve look to greatly affect the Bank of Korea's future policy direction?
Of course, US Fed's interest rate level is a major factor for Bank of Korea's interest rate decision. As US key interest rate becomes 5.5% this week, central bank's key interest rate gap between Korea and US becomes 2%. For Bank of Korea, this is something never experienced a gap in the past. According to economic theory and experiences related to this situation, as the interest rate gap increases, there will be higher possibility of capital outflow from domestic market and more depreciation of Korean won against US dollars. But the fact is, foreign investors in Korea are actually not withdrawing money from domestic stocks and bonds market. And exchange rate is very stable, even with a 1.75% interest rate gap between US and Korea. So Bank of Korea believes that current over almost 2% interest rate gap between the two countries does not destabilize domestic financial market. However, it should be noted that much higher interest rate gap, well over 2%, like 3%, can be a trigger of domestic financial market turmoil.
Right. Professor Shin, back in the US then, now it's been said that America's sturdy economy and its record low unemployment well over a year since the Fed's aggressive tightening policy have perplexed pundits there. Have they baffled you?
To answer that, let me first point out the reason why the fact that the unemployment rate has not been associated with the tight monetary policy may be stunning. This is because it has been widely believed that the inflation rate and unemployment rate are negatively correlated, which is characterized by a so-called Phillips curve. According to the curve, low inflation rate should sacrifice unemployment, and hence there is a trade-off from the monetary policy. However, it is widely observed that such a relationship hasn't shown become much more faint since the early 2000s and has attracted a lot of macroeconomists, implying that the disconnect between the two variables observed these days may not be that astonishing. I also think that the current situation gives us the sign that the US economy has been really hit after the COVID-19 crisis, so that even the high inflation rate cannot destroy the job very easily.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, back here in the country, Professor Shim, prospects on the export front are looking quite bleak. What is your outlook moving forward?
I also have a pessimistic view on the export. First, the export has not been high, even though it would have benefited from low Korean won value compared to the US these days, as pointed out by Professor Kim. If domestic currency is undervalued, say we need more won to obtain the same amount of dollar, Korean exporting firms would have more competitive power in terms of price. I think the historically higher level of the interest rate gap between Korea and the US could support such a situation. However, such a large interest rate gap cannot be sustainable, which will potentially negatively affect the price competitiveness of the Korean exporters and hence further increase the trade deficit. Second, the tightened monetary policy in the US, as well as other advanced economies like the European countries, has made it difficult to export due to lower demand. I think this trend seems to continue during the remaining year because of the Russian invasion is expected to over very soon. And the global economy is expected to decline due to high interest rate, and also barriers to exports, such as the IRA Act, can be implemented.
Right, I see. And against that backdrop, Professor Kim, what is the overall outlook with regard to Korea's economic growth for this year, do you think?
Well, according to economic institutions' economic growth forecast for this year of Korean economy, like Bank of Korea's, Korean government's, IMF, KDI, and so on, this year's economic growth forecasts are located around 1.5%. And last year's economic growth was 2.6% on year. That means this year's economic growth is at least 1% lower than that of last year's. Relatively speaking, 1% economic growth decrease is a huge decline in terms of economic growth. This declining of domestic economy is mostly generated by declining export due to slowing Chinese economy and also slowing global chip market. According to Bank of Korea's explanation, as we have seen from previous report, it looks that Korean economy is recovering very slowly. Korea's real GDP increased 0.6% on quarter in the second quarter, accelerating from a 0.3% expansion in the first quarter. So Korean economy has been on a recovery pace since it contracted 0.3% in the last quarter of last year, 2022. So on yearly basis, South Korea's economy expanded 0.9%, almost 1% in the second quarter. So I think the economic growth situation will get better as we approach the end of this year.
Right, hopefully, of course. Professor Kim, Korea has been found to rank, that is, second among the world's major economies in terms of household debt and its growth. Could you tell us a bit more about this reality and about the reason behind it?
As we know, in the last 5 years, we saw a rapid increase of household loan, mortgage loan, due to the boom of the housing market. The relative size of household debt against GDP is about 103%. That means household debt in aggregate is as large as the GDP of Korean economy. And I think this would be the weakest point of Korean economy as a whole. But as the market interest rate goes up quickly from last year, household loan decreased for the first time in 5 years. However, from April of this year, households loan picks up again due to housing market recovery. But this time's mortgage loan is kind of different from last 5 years because it is the young workers in their 20s and early 30s. They are maybe newly married couples who borrow mortgage loan from banks. In previous periods, quite a few apartment investors also borrowed money from banks for just investment. So it means it makes difficult for Korean government and Bank of Korea to constrain their mortgage loan through applying tight DSR and DTI on young people's mortgage loans from banks.
Right, I see. And before we delve into the potential solutions, then, Professor Shim, generally speaking, what could be the broader risks of this reality for any country, the reality of having a ballooning household debt situation?
Well, we actually have a very recent experience, the financial crisis between 2007 and 2009, to learn the risk of high household debt. Among all the recessions after the World War II in the US, the financial crisis is known to be the episode with a large decline in the aggregate activity together with slow recovery compared to the usual recession. I think the risk could be greater than before by the following reasons. The most important risk is that household debt can trigger a very severe recession if it is associated with the finding and the belief that housing price will decline. Then, financially constrained households will lower their consumption. And the problem here is that we are living in a high interest rate regime that makes the impact to be even greater, since more households will be borrowing constrained. Then lower consumption will also pull down the aggregate economy, such as GDP, and such an effect would be greater. One important problem is that the Bank of Korea will not be able to lower the interest rate unless there is a clear sign that inflation risk faint, so that inflation is, because inflation is usually argued to be more costly than the economic fluctuations. So I believe that stabilizing the financial market is really important at this point.
Right, and also keeping the risks that Professor Shim has just mentioned. Professor Kim, what potential solutions do you propose to ease Korea's soaring household debt?
Well, that is a tough question, Sunny. It is not difficult to stabilize households' loan increase for Bank of Korea and government. Bank of Korea can just raise the base interest rate, and Korean government can apply more strict DSR and DTI on household loans. But as we talked about before, recent household loan or mortgage loan is generated by young generation who are the end users of apartment, not by the speculators in apartment. So in this respect, government should decide on the priority between stabilizing financial market by controlling households loan and providing housing to young generations. It is not easy decision because providing apartment to young people is highly related to Korea's population policy in the middle of super low birth rate, super low marriage rate, and population decrease. So for that purpose, Korean government should be deciding on between stabilizing financial market by more strict monetary policy or providing more apartment to young generation.
Right, and speaking about the young generation, but moving forward, Professor Kim, another concern here on the local front is the jobless rate among the youth in the country. How severe is the situation? And again, what are some potential solutions, Professor?
The young generations or young workers job market situation is another weak point of Korean economy. Even though Korean economy is not growing as fast as last year, the total employment is improving this year. Particularly, employment in service sector is increasing quickly as COVID pandemic disappears. And females employee also grows faster than males because female workers are more involved in service sector. But the unemployment rate for all age cohorts is about 2.6% as of July. But in the same month, the unemployment for young workers between 15 years old and 29 years old is about 6.3%, which more than doubles that of the total unemployment rate. This high unemployment for young people shows seriousness of the job market for young generation. And since President Yoon's government says that government does not excessively provide temporary jobs for young workers because it does have negative impacts in the long run. The only solution would be improving economic growth and improving business-friendly environment for private corporations.
Right, I see. Professor Shim, despite the weak employment numbers among the youth here, though, employment figures among the elderly are said to be quite remarkable. How do you explain these findings, then?
I think the most important reason behind the situation is the mismatch problem in the labor market. On average, workers hired by the small and medium-sized firms earn about half of those hired by the large firms. More importantly, the wage gap between these two types of workers become larger over time. which makes young workers looking for jobs posted by large firms. But it's not that a problem for old workers, so that makes the problem worse. And hence, more young workers will stay as jobless. And I think that the concentration on Seoul metropolitan area is also the problem. While the elderly can get jobs, I think, outside of Seoul, but young people strictly prefer the Seoul metropolitan area because many opportunities, including better jobs, better education, and better culture, better opportunities to share culture. So this makes the young workers to search only for jobs in such an area like Seoul, and it makes the problem to continue and worsen the situation.
Right, I see, unfortunately. Well, hopefully we'll have measures that seek to diversify job opportunities for our youth beyond the capital region then. All right, Professor Shim, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Kim, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
Right, well, this ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. See you same time tomorrow. That is Wednesday.